Now, you are going to unfold how long this federal process is going to take, and I think we'll get there. Let's stop and see if there's questions or thoughts that people are having about the scenario that we've done so far. Is that all right?
Fine.
Okay. Does anybody, dark night, truck slams, radioactivity is traveling in smoke, people are immediately impacted?
How far is that radioactivity in the smoke likely to go?
Good question. There's an immediate deposition that would, as Bill said, probably be on the order of square miles in the immediate area. But if it's a foggy, rainy night, like I said, the smoke has enough updraft to take those particles up into the clouds, and that may travel hundreds of miles before it rains out as fallout, just like the atomic bombs had fallout that came down thousands of miles away from where the bomb blast happened. It's very spotty. It doesn't mean that it contaminates the whole area, the whole volume of space in those thousands of miles. It means that there might be rain falling on the driveway that has particles of radioactivity in it, but not over at those tents, just that close together. Mm-hmm. You might get a hot spot of fallout and no fallout. So it's next to impossible to totally track this stuff, which is why prevention is the only cure.
And you talked about the emergency responders being contaminated. You talked about all of the people that arrive, first responders, I guess, of all sorts. What is their immediate, is it a latent onset sickness that they're going to be dealing with? Is it a visible thing that happens to them?
Well, this particular material, if it's not shielded at all, will give you a lethal dose in less than a minute. The image that was given to me when I started learning about this stuff is that these are fuel rods and they're about 16 feet long. If you got on a motorcycle and accelerated so that you were going as fast as the motorcycle can go, in those 16 feet as you went by that fuel rod ran the bike right next to it, you would get a lethal dose. That is how high the radiation field is. Now, this scenario does not involve the whole thing being dumped out on the pavement. So there's still shielding. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is that you can't put enough shield on these containers, even when they're perfect, to completely knock down the X-ray type radiation that can penetrate stuff. So they come up with allowable levels. You never want to lock down to one of these containers because it's 10 chest X-rays an hour at the surface of this container. But as you get away about 6 feet, you're down to 2 chest X-rays an hour. But they're continuously emitting radiation, even when they're perfect, with no accident at all. So one might well imagine that as the smoke was lofting some particles, that some of those particles would have contaminated that immediate area. And so I would say that the people who are in that immediate area are at grave risk for not necessarily lethal levels of radiation, but levels that will vastly increase their chance of getting cancer. If there's a pregnant individual there, that she would have a child that would have a problem, whether it be at the time of birth or childhood cancer is often what happens to somebody who had a radiation exposure prior to birth. They get cancer in their early childhood. Mm-hmm.
And as you were saying earlier, if they breathe it in, then we multiply the impact.
Right.
And it doesn't take much to breathe it.
Right.
To breathe in to cause trouble.
And the deposition in that several square mile area we talked about, well, next time it rains, that particles are going to get washed down. They may get incorporated in foodstuffs, in animals' bodies. They may get into drinking water. Many of these elements will continue to circulate in our environment for thousands of years, some for hundreds of years, some for just a few minutes. But in those few minutes, they have the capacity to cause the kind of damage that can be lethal to an individual 20 years later from cancer. So, again, prevention is the only cure in this case.
And you spoke about bringing them to the hospital. So they don't really present with any visible injury unless caused by the wreck.
Right. And even lethal doses of radiation, you can't see radiation, you can't smell it, you don't feel at the time that you're being burned, although I can testify personally that you can feel the effect like a sunburn at some levels. So these individuals might start having symptomology in the next few hours, few days. At high levels, you lose some of your hair almost immediately. You start having diarrhea, sometimes things that look like bleeding from various parts of the body. Very, very high acute doses result in essentially having been, it's the euphemism, but you're cooked. And literally your tissue is cooked. So the people who die of acute radiation syndrome are dying because their cells were literally killed by the radiation.
And then on top of that whole scenario, you have to worry about the fact that Joe and Jane six-pack out there are now going to panic. Now, they might be in Spartanburg.
And not downwind.
Not downwind, but they're going to panic over the thought of radiation, which, if you think about it, will create more chaos than the accident itself. It doesn't take much to create chaos. And when you have people who are scared, the chaos that follows is frightening. And we don't educate the public as to what's going on, and a lot of the public is not interested in being educated. It's a very rare group, that, as we have here, that cares to be educated about what's going on. So you would have that, then you have the whole government overlay that comes in and tries to take control of the situation. So then you have feelings hurt by the locals. They just moved right in and took over. Yeah, and they probably didn't know as much as you did. Because none of the people that are coming in, maybe the Nuclear Regulatory Commission people, the safety board is good at wrecks. They're real good at wrecks. They can figure out why that truck crashed, how much force was exerted where, but they're not trained in nuclear. FEMA is certainly not educated in nuclear. They just are real good at bringing a whole lot of stuff to bear on a problem. Whether it's coordinated or not is another issue altogether. And that chaos, on top of the other chaos, on top of the wreck, is what tears apart communities. So you've got...
We should also mention that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will come in and do some math and determine that given the direction of the plume that in their view had almost no radioactivity in it at all, and the density of population, et cetera, that it was a nominal exposure, less than what you would get from a whole year living on planet Earth without any other type of exposure known as background radiation, and not to worry. And that would be the official story unless and until somebody comes forward with hard evidence that that's wrong.
And they will block whatever efforts are made to come up with that other evidence.
Right.
So it is a wonderful system that we have. We have resources that can be brought to bear. FEMA can set up and bring in tractor trailers full of equipment to handle situations. They have just hundreds of good people working there, but the leadership is working just as it did with Katrina on minimizing the exposure of the government to a problem. It's not so much to help, it is to limit the exposure of the government to a problem. And as long as they can do that, they're happy. They have done their job.